He watched her through the thin sliver of glass beside the bedroom curtains, an ordinary frame of morning light turning the kitchen into a sheet of soft gold. Jessica paused at the car, one hand on the door, and for a moment, she was nothing but a silhouette against the street, familiar and unknowable at once. Then she lifted her face, inhaled like someone taking a sip of something that made the air taste sweeter, and smiled. It was the kind of smile that had once moved him to cross a crowded room. It was private and untroubled and small, the way someone smiles when they fold a secret into the safe part of themselves. For reasons David could not name, it settled into him like a stone. He watched the way it touched the edges of her mouth, softened the thin line between her eyes. He watched until she slid behind the steering wheel, and when the taillights blinked and she drove away, the smile stayed with him, a ghost that walked the house. 6 months earlier, the two of them had been ordinary in all the ways that make marriage comfortable. Coffee and shirts on a hook, a shared calendar that fit on the fridge, a dog that shed in predictable patches. David was an accountant. Numbers were his rough comfort. Jessica was a nurse, the kind who remembered small details about people and could hold a restless toddler with one hand while charting medication with the other. They had not been dramatic. They had been steady. He had thought their life would always be the sum of those steadinesses. Then, without any dramatic conversation at the table or a fight worn like a crease across their days, things began to change. It started with an extra hour at work, then a new tone in her laugh. She bought a perfume that smelled of citrus and rain, not the soft floral she had worn for years. She began humming, softly, as if rehearsing a song she could not yet name. Sometimes she would come home and stand at the sink, rinsing a dish and staring out the window as if she were making sure the world outside still existed. The first time he commented on her late nights, she brushed it away with a joke. The second time, she apologized with a tired smile and a promise that nothing had changed. But the smile, that secretive glow, grew more frequent, and David found himself cataloging the moments it appeared. Waiting at the mailbox, alone at the bus stop, tilting her head in the middle of a story. He would remember those smiles during the workday, and something that had been simple and secure began to feel porous around the edges. At work, numbers sat stubbornly in front of him, while his mind rewound scenes from the morning. He missed deadlines not because he was careless, but because a small private image had become a problem he could not ignore. One night, he misread a balance sheet and almost cost a client a late fee. He waved it off with a forced laugh in the conference room and drove home with the knot in his chest tight enough to bruise. He began to wake at 3 a.m., the world outside feathered in cold blue, and he would lay awake wondering whether a smile could mean so many things. Marco noticed it before anyone else. They had been friends since college. Marco with a sarcastic grin and a bluntness that sometimes felt more like a shove than a hand. He came over one Thursday night for a beer and to watch a game David no longer fully cared about. Halfway through the second quarter, Marco paused the show and fixed David with that arena of honest friendship look. "You've been staring at your phone like a man who needs a better hobby," Marco said, handing him the remote. "Talk to me. What's up?" David said it with a laugh that didn't reach his eyes. "Jessica's been... There's this smile. She smiles like she keeps something in reserve." Marco shrugged, then leaned forward, elbows on his knees. "Are you saying she's not yours? Because if you think she's taking lessons in how to be mysterious and charming, that's a different problem." "Not that," David said, and it was true in the strictest sense. It wasn't late-night texts or whispered phone calls he'd seen. It was the way she had changed, soft and private and bright in a way that made him feel like a room whose lights had been dimmed without explanation. "What if it's nothing?" Marco suggested. "What if it's just Jessica being Jessica? Maybe she's discovered a new podcast. Maybe you're projecting. Men do that, you know. Get suspicious, see a pattern that isn't there." "Maybe," David said. It had the ring of an answer, but it didn't settle anything inside him. That night, as he lay awake again, he thought of the first time he had seen her laugh like that. 6 years ago, at a friend's backyard wedding, when she had danced like she owned the grass beneath her feet. He had fallen in love on the spot. He tried to reach that memory now, to anchor himself, but the new smile seemed to hover between past and present like a negotiation. He started noticing practical differences. Jessica's phone had a new lock he couldn't crack, which was presumptuous and also unnecessary to say in a room where privacy is supposed to be mutual. She began leaving their grocery list half-finished, replaced by notes she tucked into her debit app, and there were receipts for cappuccinos from streets he had never driven. He saw a receipt from a cab to somewhere downtown at 11 p.m., and the numbers jittered across his brain like static. None of it proved anything. None of it meant that she was unfaithful. Still, the human habit of the heart is to create patterns out of stray stitches, and David found himself sewing a narrative out of small, oddly colored threads. When he followed her, it was a decision made in the kind of quiet desperation that feels less like calculation and more like the body taking a step his mind did not authorize. He told himself he would only watch. He told himself he would keep to distant sidewalks and watch for evidence that might justify the cold, aching questions in his chest. He would, he promised himself, learn the truth and then come home and be honest with her, either with apologies or with distance. He kept that promise to himself for 5 blocks, then 6. He kept it until he lost sight of the rearview mirror and found instead the flat, empty line of the highway and the kind of silence that presses on the skin. He did not sneak into her building or into her office. He stayed in the car, parked in a public lot, and watched ordinary strangers cross the sidewalk and press into the doors of a high-rise with the name Hoffman Enterprises engraved in brass letters at the curb. The building's facade was glass and geometry. The city mirrored in the panels made everything feel the same temperature as the sky. He watched Jessica cross the stone plaza with a brisk, sure stride. When she paused under the awning and looked up, that smile came back not to him, he was not the visible audience, but to something private inside her. She stepped through the revolving door and disappeared into the tower, and the world calved neatly into before and after. He had no reason to be there, and a voice in his head that still owned a little of his better judgment told him to leave. Instead, he circled the block twice, parked again, and walked past the lobby with every sense reporting too loudly. Inside, people navigated the space with the polished indifference of the city class. Phones, briefcases, practiced smiles. He lingered at the edge of the atrium and watched a bank of elevators slide open and close like the breathing of a machine. He had not meant to come inside, but being near, he told himself, might yield the answer he had been bargaining with his thoughts for weeks. On the 47th floor, the doors opened onto glass. He couldn't see inside, privacy tinted and the angle skewed, but he could feel the rumor of a world that was not his, a place of executive chairs and meetings and names like Hoffman that suggested a weight stronger than his. He saw a woman he thought might be Jessica step into the corridor, and another man, a taller man with a careful smile and a presence like an announcement, walk with her out of the frame. From this distance, his mind supplied the details: closeness, camaraderie, the betrayal of proximity. He left before anything definitive happened. He came home with his palms sweaty and the hand sanitizer residue smell clinging to his nose, and he slept badly. When he woke the next morning, there was the old, childish temptation to show her that he knew, that he had been near the place she'd been. He wanted to accuse her in the way a man startled might, to force an explanation that would either break the spell or reveal the truth. Instead, he called Marco. Marco's reaction was what David expected, a mixture of half concern, half encouragement, and a dangerous streak of vindication. "You followed her to a glass tower?" Marco said, not pausing to imagine the moral tangle beneath the words. "Okay. That is either the beginning of a great detective story or a movie that ends badly." "She wasn't alone," David said. "There was a man, Richard Hoffman. They walked together." He heard his own voice, thin at the edges. Saying the name made things feel real, like a catalog entry that could be checked against the truth. Marco's laugh this time was sharp. "Hoffman? The Hoffman? Billionaire Hoffman?" "The same. I haven't—" He stopped because saying the name felt like dropping a pebble into a pool whose ripples he couldn't control. "I don't know what it means. Don't jump to wreckage, but if it makes you breathe easier, you can hire someone. Look, if you're not sure, get facts, otherwise you stew." It was the worst counsel, practical and enabling. It appealed to a man's desire to make his inner sentence visible. David knew it was wrong in the way that an angered man will sometimes know the slaps before he gives them. But Marco's suggestion honored a nagging portion of David that needed an authority beyond his own suspect heart. He didn't tell Jessica he had been to the tower. He did not tell her he had followed her steps in a glass world that evening. He told himself he would ask her gently, that he would trust her enough to let her explain. But within the week, with the paranoia old as winter knitting tighter around his days, he made a call. Frank Sullivan had a nameplate worn like a second face. He had been in the business long enough that his jokes arrived at the right moment, dry, slightly self-deprecating. When David called, the voice on the phone did not judge. It simply asked questions with the kind of precision David had been craving. "You're hiring a private investigator because you suspect your wife is having an affair," Frank said at their first meeting in a small cafe, the newspapers folded like props on the next table. He said it not like a confession that would be saved, but like a fact he had catalogued. He had already listened to a version of this story 1,000 times, a spouse's fear folded into a narrative that needed proof. He presented his fees plainly. For all the moral weight in the room, the exchange felt businesslike, clinical. David lay out the facts, the smile, the late nights, the Hoffman building. He swallowed the shame when he admitted he had gone there himself. He tried to keep his voice steady, but when he described watching her in the lobby and seeing the man with her, something in him loosened, part grief, part relief at finally speaking aloud a secret that had become an accusation of its own. Frank didn't say she was cheating. He didn't say anything that could be slotted into a drama script. He took notes with a pen that clicked like a metronome and asked about habits, addresses, times, the minutiae that looked like obsession until you labeled them concern. "I only do surveillance in public spaces," he said simply. "No breaking in, no hacking. I document what I can see. If you want confirmation, you'll get it through images and records that are above board." That line, no breaking in, no hacking, rested like a fence between what David felt he deserved and what morality demanded. He gave his card and his credit card and slept worse that night than before. The next morning, Frank emailed him a short note. "I'll start in 2 days. I will be discreet." David tried to tell himself that hiring Frank was a necessary step to save what he had. He told himself that if something terrible was happening, it was better to know. Believing that felt like swallowing a bitter medicine. He owed Jessica truth, but he also wanted to be spared the unknown. The difference between wanting to know and wanting to control blurred until it felt like one thing. The days that followed were a study in small torments. David watched Jessica from the safety of their kitchen window in a way that felt obscene. He looked for the smile and catalogued variation like a scientist. He watched the way she tacked a scarf around her neck at the end of winter, the way she sorted pills into a container on Sunday nights, the way she read a short article about an infectious outbreak, and then slid the laptop closed. He tried to read her, to map the geography of her days into a sequence he could understand. He failed often. He started catching himself at odd times, standing in front of their wedding photo on the mantel, tracing the line of someone he had once loved, as if it were a road map he could follow back to safety. They had promised things to each other they had not named. He could still see the vow they had spoken in a little chapel with bright windows, to keep each other's secrets, to be protectors. He had not spoken the clause that said, "Unless a secret becomes bigger than the two of you." That clause had no place at the altar. It had only place now, in the quiet moments when the world offered him the shape of a suspicion. When Frank finally delivered his first packet, David felt a childlike mixture of dread and hunger. The images came in a slender envelope, photographs on paper, a few location timestamps, small notes in Frank's handwriting. Frank asked him to come by the office. The place smelled faintly of old coffee and documents. Frank's desktop was orderly in a way that made David feel like he was entering a professional confession booth. There were 3 photos. The first showed Jessica in a lobby, the angle wide enough to see the marble floor and the logo at the entrance. She was laughing with someone whose face the camera could only just capture at the edge, a tall figure with a careful profile. The second was taken in a corridor, Jessica and the same man, hands gesturing, leaning in as people do when they are engrossed. The third was a close-up of Jessica sitting at a glass table, a stack of folders in front of her, one of them marked with a discreet letterhead. The photo was cropped so that the hand-lettered title on the folder, Bright Futures, was visible. David's breath stalled at that single phrase, as if the letters themselves had the weight of an accusation. Bright futures. Bright enough to be a beacon. The name pulled his imagination into two simultaneous shapes, hope and secrecy. He imagined a charity, warm rooms, children with small hands, bandaged knees and repaired lungs. He also imagined clandestine meetings and whispered commitments in hotel lobbies. Frank watched him without comment. The silence was a tool. "There are more documents," Frank said finally. "Bank statements, meeting minutes, philanthropic contracts. It's all in the file. You wanted facts?" David reached out and touched the folder. His fingers flattened against the paper like he could read it by contact. He felt relief first, then a new, raw edge of betrayal that had nothing to do with the photos and everything to do with the hidden space between them. He left the office in a daze. On the sidewalk, the day was brutally ordinary. People with fast steps, a dog pulling its owner, a street vendor with coffee steam curling up like a sign. He held the photos like contraband. Part of him kept wanting to hurry home, fling them across the table, demand an explanation and watch it untangle. Another part wanted to put the photos in the safe and never open the lid, to protect the image of the life he thought he had. At home he made coffee and sat at the kitchen table with the morning light pooling across it. Jessica came in an hour later, wearing the perfume that smelled like rain. When she saw him at the table, he could see the small confusion on her face, the way she lowered her head when she entered a room that felt like a different world now. Without thinking, without any plan, he set the photographs on the table between them. Her hand paused at the edge of the paper. The smile he had watched months ago was absent. In its place was the kind of thin readiness people wear when they suspect something is wrong. "David?" she said softly. He said the words he had rehearsed in his head and discarded because they felt too violent. "Who is Richard Hoffman to you?" Then he realized he had framed the question around a name that might not even be the right fit for the person in the photos. "Who is the man in the photos, Jessica?" Her mouth opened and closed, the way the ocean seems to pause in one small swell before it moves. For the first time since the smile had begun its quiet life in his mind, she looked like someone being held in balance between two things, truth and fear. She folded her hands on the table and began quietly to explain not why she had been meeting people in the tower, but how what she had been doing had started. "It began in the children's ward," she said, voice low. "There was a little girl named Emma. She had been there for weeks. Her mother sat in a folding chair at the end of the bed, reading a book with one hand and holding Emma's tiny fingers with the other. They were waiting for charity support, morphine, tests, procedures, and every time the hospital called, the mother said the same thing. "We'll manage somehow." I shouldn't have been the only one who heard the way she said it. It broke something open in me. David listened like a man catching the echo of a distant bell. He wanted for a moment to stop her. He wanted to say that whatever had moved her, however noble, did not justify secrets. But listening required its own courage. He realized then that one of the reasons he had been so furious was not only the fear of an affair, but the idea that Jessica might have built a life apart from him, an island where she could be brave and he could not follow. His anger had been a jealous possession of not only her time but her inner life. "I started making small donations," she continued. "I gathered people I could trust, nurses, a social worker, a retired neighbor who liked to bake. We ran a pilot program, get a family through immediate crises, connect them to larger resources. It worked. People started asking us to help more. I thought I could do it quietly, without making it part of us until I was sure. I thought if I told you too soon you'd be practical and you'd shut me down and I couldn't lose the momentum, so I kept it in my breast pocket like a seed." "It has a name," David said finally, the word Bright Futures awkward and foreign in his mouth. He looked at the sunlit letters, the way the consonants hooked like a child's cursive. The irony of a thing meant to be bright being kept in secrecy did not escape him. Jessica's eyes softened. "I wanted it to be something we built together," she said. "I wanted to bring you in when I knew how to ask." There was a pause, a thin time of breath and thought. He had been prepared for confession, and not for that trembling, careful hope. He had been expecting an affair to slice their world in two. Instead, a different seam was being revealed, one that cut through their shared future because it had been stitched without his thread. He told her about the tower and the man he had seen in the photographs. He told her about Frank and the envelope and how he had felt them like evidence and accusation at once. Her face moved through a grid of expressions: surprise, then thin disappointment, then an admission that stung deeper than betrayal. "You should have told me," David said. The words were not a sentence, but a verdict he had been rehearsing for nights. "I know," she said, each syllable honest fire. "I should have. I was terrified you'd tell me to stop. I was terrified you'd see it and decide I'd be foolish. I didn't want to lose you to the part of me that needed to try." He could hear his mouth shaping lines they'd once spoken in different order: love, fear, endurance, and find none of them sufficient. He wanted to be angry in the performative way he had seen in films: slam a door, speak hard lines, leave. Instead, his voice worked like a worn tool and came out blunt and unsure. "You kept everything from me," he said. "The people, the money, the meetings." "I thought I could protect you," she said. "Protect us. I realize now that I was protecting my dream at the expense of our partnership." There is a precise cruelty in silence after revelation, the way it sharpens voices and throws light on the things that were hidden. They sat with it for a long while. Outside, a neighbor's radio carried a soft song. Inside, the house smelled faintly of lemon cleaner. For a moment, they were simply two people marooned on a small island of truth. "I hired someone," David admitted, hating the confession even as it escaped him, "to follow you, to get proof." Jessica's eyes filled with water quickly and shamefully. "David." "I know," he said. "It was wrong. I know it was wrong." She reached over and placed her hand on his. It was a careful thing, not a theatrical turning, but the barest attempt at bridge building. "I should have told you sooner," she said. "I was afraid you'd talk me out of something I had to try, but I never wanted to keep you out of my life. Not really. I thought I could manage the shame of failing alone." The admission threw the seam of their marriage into view. Both of them had been trying to protect something by keeping part of themselves back. He had been guarding against loss by watching and measuring. She had been guarding a fragile hope by secrecy. "I didn't want to be the man who stood in the way of your dream," David said. It came out softer than he intended, as if the truth finally had given his chest room to breathe. But the next thing he said cracked louder. "I also didn't want to be the fool who believed anything without seeing it." They both laughed then, something like a break in thin ice. Not a celebration, but a release. It was the first time in months David felt that the weight in his chest had shifted. He felt a little less like a man about to be left behind and more like someone who had been shown a room he didn't know existed in his own house. When Jessica told him about the children's ward, she named names. She spoke of Emma, a tiny child with a sleeve of IV that had scared her at first. Marcus, a boy whose laugh had returned after a small surgery. Tyler, who had needed a device to help him breathe at night and whose mother had slept on a hospital chair for 2 weeks. She spoke of nights when she had sat at their kitchen table sketching budgets and network maps, and feeling like she had both less time and more resolve. She mentioned the 47th floor only as a place where meetings happened, because that was where one of the partners who had offered meeting space worked. She mentioned Hoffman with a careful neutrality that acknowledged the man's public life and his private generosity. David listened and stitched the new information into the story he had been telling himself. The story didn't remove the pain of secrecy or the wrongness of his surveillance, but it made the silhouette of what had been happening sharper and more complicated. He felt the cooling of a fever that had been fed on suspicion. He also felt the tremor of a new kind of danger, the danger of not knowing how to be useful now that the truth had been partially revealed. "I should have told you," she said again. "I'm sorry." For the first time since the stone of the smile had lodged against his ribs, David felt the possibility of something like forgiveness. It wasn't clean, it wasn't immediate. It was messy and slow and would require conversation and proof and time. But it existed. After several evenings of late conversations and a night when they both sat up and made a plan that was more hope than strategy, David found himself at a crossroad between what had been and what could be. He could let the betrayal of omission harden into a fortress and retreat into that place of safe assumption, or he could follow the other, murkier path, one where mistakes had been made, apologies given, and a new kind of partnership could yet be negotiated. He made a decision that felt like a surrender and a challenge at once. He would read the file Frank had assembled. He would let the facts speak without the thrum of fear-made interpretation. He told Jessica this, and she nodded with the relief of someone who had been holding herself in thin compartments and could finally open a drawer. When he opened the folder that evening, after the children had been tucked into bed and the house had the soft hiss of air and the cat sleeping on the throw, the documents were plain and unornamented. Bank transfers to hospitals, lists of urgent needs, volunteer rosters, and emails arranging care packages. There was a ledger of small broken things mended, operations paid for, nights of care funded, tests purchased. The handwriting on some notes was Jessica's, precise, compact, the kind that fits around children like a careful hand. There were also letters of support from people David knew only by name or reputation, one of them bearing the Hoffman seal, and a note of the man's discreet encouragement. The images Frank had taken were there too, the lobby, the corridor, the stack of folders. When he reached the page with the photograph of the folder, the word Bright Futures smiled back at him again, and this time, the letters did not feel like accusation. They felt like the name of an idea that had carried a risk Jessica had been afraid to name. He imagined Emma asleep in a hospital bed, and then Marcus throwing back his head and laughing, and Tyler drawing a crooked picture of a dog. He felt, for a precarious moment, part of it, like someone who had been invited into an attic and found boxes stacked with the life they had not yet touched. He put the documents back in the folder with hands that trembled for reason and sorrow. He could feel the price of what he had done and of what she had not told him. There would be consequences. There would need to be apologies and new boundaries and possibly the painful lessons of trust rebuilt from small patient bricks. He called Frank and asked for more information, for a complete printout of transactions, for timestamps of meetings, for anything that would allow him to understand the scale of what Jessica had been building. It felt, both then and now, like doing the sensible thing, even as he admitted to himself that some of the sensibility had been spoiled by fear. That night he dreamed of a smile that was no longer a ghost but a doorway. He woke with the taste of citrus in his mouth, Jessica's perfume, and a thought that had the clarity of an outline. If the project was real, and if it was being done with the care she described, perhaps there was a place in it for the part of him that had always been good at sorting numbers, at making sure meant what it said. But he also knew how easy it was to fold a noble purpose into secrecy. He had seen people build sanctuaries of goodness that excluded those they loved, not through malice but through a fear that tenderness might be lost if tasks were made public too soon. He thought about the ethics of his own choice to hire Frank, and about how thin the road between protective action and invasive betrayal can be. The next day he kept checking his phone for Frank's call. When it came, his voice tightened with the weight of expectation. "I've got a little more," Frank said. "I'll drop it by tonight." When the envelope arrived, David hesitated before opening it. Standing in the hallway with the city light leaking through the curtains, he felt both like a man about to read a verdict, and like one who had been handed the keys to a room he had never been taught to enter. He slit the flap and fanned the pages. There were more photographs and a set of printed emails that showed formal requests for funding and acknowledgments of payment to hospitals. There was a line item in one document that read simply, "Bright Futures, Emergency Pediatric Fund." There were names underneath, Emma, Marcus, Tyler, each attached to the kind of short case notes that made numbers human. At the bottom of the packet, Frank had placed a single, smaller envelope with his handwriting. "If you want to understand what this is, read this first. If you want confrontation, skip it." David sat at the table and for a moment felt a dangerous pull toward an action that would be easier and crueler. He slid the note out and read, This is not what you feared. It might be something you can join. The words were not a deliverance. They were a catalyst. They asked more of him than he had been willing to give that morning. They forced him to confront what he had done, and what might yet be salvaged. They forced him to see that the path forward would not be a straight line but a set of deliberate choices. Between secrecy and sharing, between guarding and opening. Outside, a car passed and its headlights carved a shallow arc across the wall. David rubbed his hands together and felt, at the center of him, the first real shift away from obsession and toward something else. A wary curiosity. He had followed his smiling wife into a place of glass and applause and felt the ground slip beneath his feet. Now he had a folder in front of him that suggested the smile had been giving away neither infidelity nor malice, but something larger that might, if he let it, change the shape of their marriage. He sat with the folder open until the kitchen clock blinked into a new hour, and the house spoke in small sounds. The heating ticking, a distant car, the cat shifting on the throw. The documents were ordinary objects carrying extraordinary choices, ledgers and emails, case notes that turned statistics into faces. At the bottom of one page, a hand had scribbled a short update about Emma's surgery and a thank you letter from her mother. On another, a photo of Marcus mid-laugh, caught between breaths as a nurse handed him a lollipop, and another note about Tyler waking through the night with a machine that hummed like distant surf, and a volunteer who took turns sitting in the fluorescent hospital chair so his mother could sleep. David let the images wash over him the way you let cold water wash at the ache in a bruise. Dull, then clearing. The impulse to clutch at explanations was still there, a muscle memory of suspicion. But something else stirred. A practical, steadier curiosity about how Bright Futures actually worked, who else was involved, and how this quiet, secret life had been kept folded inside the woman he loved. He put the folder back into its envelope and called Jessica. The line clicked and she answered with a small, puzzled, "Hey," as if she were stepping into the middle of a sentence. "Can we talk?" he said without preamble. "Tonight. At home." There was a long inhale on the other end. Okay. When she came in that evening, there was a hesitation in the way she took off her coat. The same careful readiness he had seen the first time he left the photographs on the table. She sat across from him, and for a moment they simply looked at each other, like two people who had been given different maps of the same room. "I read everything," David said. "Frank left me more. He stopped because the next thing could be an apology or a demand. He wanted to choose the right shape for it. Jessica folded her fingers together to still them. "I suspected you might find out," she said. "I didn't know how to say it without sounding like I was asking for your permission." "You should have told me," he said, the load of his tiredness pressing into the words. "I was wrong to follow you. I should never have hired Frank. That was a betrayal." He meant it. Saying the admission aloud pulled some of the thorn from his chest. It did not erase the fact of his action, but it set the stage for something else. Responsibility. He owed that to her, and also to the families whose names he had just read. Jessica's smile, quiet now, softer than before, tilted with a fragile kindness that had the effect of a small light in a dark room. "I know," she said. "I can't make what you did okay, but I need you to know why I didn't tell you sooner." She spoke then not as a defendant but as a person reclaiming a story. She told him about the hospital nights that had hollowed the space inside her where courage lived, and then filled it with the precise insistence to act. She told him how difficult it had been to be a nurse in a system that often stretched families until they frayed, and how a few small acts, an unexpected donor covering a bill, a neighbor knitting hats for children who'd lost hair to chemo, had become the scaffolding for something larger. She told him about a pilot program with 5 families that became 20 within 3 months, because word spread among hospital social workers like an urgent whisper. She told him she had feared his practicality would drown the nascent thing before it could breathe. David listened and, oddly, the feeling that rose in him was not triumph or vindication, but a kind of protective wonder. Here was this private architecture she had built out of care, and she had kept it secret because of fear. He could see the logic now. Flawed, yes, but human. Her secrecy had been an attempt to protect a fragile hope more than to exclude him. That did not absolve it, but it offered a doorway. "I want to be part of it," he said suddenly, the words startling even him. "If you're open to it." Jessica's face softened in a way that took his breath. "I wanted to bring you in when I knew how to ask," she said. "I didn't know how to find the right time." They talked then until late into a night of small, earnest negotiations, about transparency, about communication, about naming failures out loud. They set rules that sounded painfully simple on paper. Regular financial reviews together, shared contact lists, a commitment to speak up when fear was driving choices. They made room for the awkwardness of rebuilding trust. David promised not to seek secret confirmations. Jessica promised to include him sooner, and both promised to forgive mistakes through the tough work of accountability. After the first week of what they called open nights, evenings when they sat together and read emails, balanced small budgets over microwave dinners, or took turns calling volunteers, their partnership began to take on a new outline. The marriage that had worn steadiness like a coat now had an extra seam where risk and purpose had been stitched into the fabric. David called Frank and asked him for a meeting, not to pry but to understand the ethics of what had been done. When he sat across from the investigator in the cluttered office, David felt both the awkward weight of his own choices and a measure of relief that he was willing to acknowledge them. "I shouldn't have done what I did without telling her," he said plainly. Frank, who had been exact and unemotional throughout the earlier exchanges, allowed a small nod. "People make choices when they hurt," he said. "They're not always choices they can be proud of. What matters is what they do next." David stayed for a while and asked Frank honest, practical questions about what kinds of documentation were helpful to nonprofit work, how to track donations, and how to ensure compliance. Frank answered in general terms, no how-tos that would cross lines, focusing on accountability and the importance of records. At the end of the meeting, David thanked him and offered to pay more than the original fee, as a recognition of the cost his surveillance had placed on his marriage. Frank accepted, and with a glance that was less business than something like empathy, said, "Make this an honest thing. That's what will save it." Working alongside Jessica was not seamless. There were awkward evenings when David misread a staff email and asked questions that exposed his lingering suspicion. There were days when Jessica, worn from hospital visits, snapped and then apologized the way people do when they are embarrassed by sudden sharpness. But slowly, the practical confidence David had always found in numbers became a gift. He had a way of drawing line items into a clear shape, of turning urgent needs into trackable commitments, of showing donors how a $5,000 grant could be scheduled into recurring support that would cover a child's treatment across months, not just by a single procedure. He learned to speak the language of nonprofit stewardship without trading in jargon. He organized the records into clear folders and created monthly summaries that did not read like cold spreadsheets but like narratives. This month's support enabled Emma's surgery. Her mother now has a job referral. Marcus's medications were covered until we find a longer-term plan. Forms and accountability did not feel like bureaucratic armor. They felt like the kind of trust someone gives when they ask another to handle something precious. As Bright Futures grew, so did the size of the choices. They recruited volunteers, nurses who knew the hospitals, a retired teacher who coordinated aftercare education, a small advisory board of people who offered expertise and connection without loud names. Marco, who had been a blunt friend and an instigator at first, became something else, a fundraiser with dogged persistence. He loved to call potential donors with the easy charm that had made him the unofficial ambassador of their neighborhood, and more than once, his offhand warmth led to a new conversation about partnership. Richard Hoffman entered their life quietly, and without the fanfare David had feared would follow his name. The first meeting between Richard and the Alberys was in a small conference room with wide windows. Richard, who was known in the city for his business acumen and his measured philanthropy, spoke with a calm precision. He asked careful questions, not about headlines but about logistics and sustainability, about how Bright Futures measured outcomes, and what the plans were for its first year. He did not flaunt his wealth or trot out gestures meant for press. He listened. When Richard mentioned that he and his husband had supported similar programs and that philanthropy had become a joint project for them, David's worry-creased assumptions about the man dissolved into the simple fact of an ally willing to help. It felt both ordinary and extraordinary, an honest exchange between people trying to make a thing work. With Richard's discreet encouragement and a pledge of space and seed funding from Hoffman Enterprises, Bright Futures moved from a volunteer patch to a small but serious operation. They were careful about publicity at first, letting success be measured in hospitals, not headlines. The trust that had once been fractured by secrecy began to knit differently, this time through shared labor, mutual correction, and small joys. They took families on visits that altered them. Jessica and David would walk into a hospital waiting room that buzzed with anxious energy and be greeted by hope-bent faces. Emma's mother stood one afternoon as David and Jessica came into the pediatric ward. She pressed David's hand with a gratitude that had all the years of late nights in it. "We couldn't have done it without you," she said simply. Marcus, who had once been so thin the bones of his cheeks were like carved wood, threw his arms around Jessica when she walked in and called her Angel Jess, with a clarity that made everyone in the room laugh and then cry. Tyler's case lodged in David in a different way. He remembered the first night they'd visited. The machine that helped Tyler breathe made a soft rhythm that sounded like rain on a tin roof, and Tyler's mother had slept in the chair by the bed with a thin blanket over her knees. David found himself sitting there, ledger closed and letting the hum of the machine make him steady. The next morning he called a few donors he scarcely recognized he knew, and arranged that night of care payments so the mother could get a motel room a few blocks away where she could shower and sleep properly. It was a small, almost pedestrian fixing, but the mother's relief had been the kind of thing that roots a person's sense of usefulness in the real world. Word spread. Hospital case managers began to call Bright Futures directly when a family needed something that fell through the cracks. Social workers started forwarding names. Volunteers who had been on the periphery began to step into leadership roles. The ledger grew, and so did the roster of small detailed miracles that the organization cataloged with modest pride. In the course of their first year, Bright Futures served 2,000 children, an official number that would later be repeated at a gala and in a newsletter, and the statistic did what statistics do. It both flattened the lives inside into a metric and offered a truthful measure of scale. Behind the number were nights of coordination, donors who sent hospital bills without seeking credit, volunteers who made home visits, and hospital staff who found a way to stretch a resource further than they'd thought possible. As the scope widened, David and Jessica found themselves learning to argue better. Their old grievances, left socks, unread texts, small slights, were still there, but they were reframed against the weight of what they were doing. They learned to let the other's courage be received instead of commandeered. When Jessica wanted to push into a new hospital partnership, and he feared they were overextending, they did not lash. They made a plan to pilot the idea with one family first. When David wanted more formal reporting and Jessica feared the time it would take away from direct care, they hired a part-time coordinator who loved spreadsheets and people in equal measure. Little compromises became the mortar. The relationship did not become perfect. There were nights when both of them woke from dreams and found old fears still waiting at the edges. There were times when David, memory like a bruise, caught himself watching Jessica's smile and then chastened himself inwardly. He learned to say the hard things sooner instead of pulling a thread of suspicion and letting it grow. Jessica learned to bring him into the exhilarating parts of her idea earlier, saying, "I have something I want to show you," instead of waiting until it was less fragile. The media notice came quietly. A local paper wrote a piece about an under-the-radar charity helping pediatric families. The writer focused on one family and told a human story rather than turning Bright Futures into a headline. Overnight, emails arrived with offers of small grants and interest from a radio host who wanted to interview Jessica and David together because he found the personal story compelling. The attention was both exhilarating and unnerving. They were careful. The work mattered more than the applause. The gala that marked Bright Futures' first anniversary was both a celebration and an accounting. The ballroom was warm and lit in soft amber. The guests were a mix of hospital administrators, volunteers, donors, and families who had been helped. A banner read, "Bright Futures 1 year, 2,000 children. At the back, a small cluster of families sat in folding chairs. Emma with her mother, Marcus with a volunteer who had helped him practice reading, Tyler and his mother smiling as if they were participating in a miracle that had been stitched, quietly, by many hands. When David took the stage, he felt a tremor that had nothing to do with the microphone. He had rehearsed what he might say, but knew the truth would need to be live. A confession without theatrical stagecraft and an invitation for partnership in the real, messy work community requires. He spoke with a voice that began hesitant and then gathered force as truth and humility found a cadence. "I followed my wife," he began, and the sentence landed in the room with an intake of breath that was half surprise and half the recognition of a story people were dying to hear. He did not dramatize the following into a spectacle. He framed it as a moment of human failing and possibility, an act he regretted and a discovery that changed everything. "I followed her because I saw a smile she carried and misread it," he said. "I wanted a reason for my fear. I wanted proof for my doubt. What I found was not what I expected. I found a woman who was risking herself on behalf of other people's children. I found a program that turned generosity into action. And most humbling of all, I found out just how small and foolish my fears had been." Jessica stood beside him, her hand in his, a small anchor. She had on a simple dress that had been favored by nurses who liked to move fast, and when she smiled at him in that room full of strangers, her face showed the history of nights and hospital fluorescent lights and the stubbornness of hope. "We started Bright Futures because we couldn't bear the idea of a child waiting for a procedure, while the family tried to come up with funds," she said. "We wanted to be the kind of people who do things when the world around us stretches thin. We didn't start it to be famous, we started it because the work needed doing." The applause that followed was steady and generous. Someone in the audience cried, softly, a sound that braided with the orchestral rise, and the room felt like a chamber where many small acts had been recognized. David's speech then turned to the fact of partnership in a marriage and in a community. "I want to say, plain and true, that my worst choice led me here," he said. "I followed a smile and it brought me to a purpose that demands more of me than fear. It asked me to own my mistakes and to be useful with what I do well. My profession taught me how to count, but this work has taught me how to give account of the heart." He did not use the stage to absolve himself. He used it to urge people to look more carefully at the lives around them and to guard their own hearts against the seductions of private fear. He thanked donors, volunteers, and hospital staff, and then he invited people to be part of a pragmatic kindness, a call for partnership that sounded more like the next step of a long conversation than a marketing pitch. After the speeches and the photographs and the roses given to the families in attendance, the night wound down to small clusters of conversations. Richard, quiet as ever, came up and offered a hand, praising the rigor with which Bright Futures had built its reports and the palpable care it brought to work. Marco sat with David and told him, with an odd tenderness, that he'd been proud to see him find his way into the thing he'd once been about to destroy. That night, walking home under the soft city glow, David and Jessica did not summon fairy tale closure. They stepped forward with the kind of tentative confidence that comes from doing hard things together. They talked about the future of Bright Futures, geographic expansion, training volunteers, a scholarship fund, and they talked about dinner plans for the next week, about keeping a running grocery list on the fridge. The domestic and the public tightened together in their lives like two threads braided to make something stronger. Time moved on in steady increments. They hired a program manager to coordinate hospital liaisons, set up recurring donation channels, and trained volunteers to maintain support beyond the immediate crisis. They created a small board made of people who believed in accountability. They were not naive. There were months when funds were thin and nights when a phone call came with urgent need, and they had to make a choice about who to prioritize. Those were the moments that tempered the organization and the marriage, forging a habit of asking, "What is the kindest thing we can do right now?" and then doing it with both hands. The smile that had once been a secretive ember became, over time, the symbol of an inner life shared rather than hidden. It surfaced in small places, at a pediatric checkup when a nurse announced good news, In the kitchen when they nailed a complicated grant report together, in the car when Jessica hummed a song David had never heard before. Sometimes it appeared in public, photographic and polished, but more often it lived in private gestures. The way David would bring Jessica a cup of tea when she came home from a long hospital shift. The way she would squeeze his knee in a board meeting when his voice faltered. They also kept their difficult lessons within reach. On anniversaries, they did not pretend the past had not happened. They sat and named the choices that had hurt them, the ways fear had driven them, and the ways vulnerability had restored them. Forgiveness, they learned, was not an event but a ritual. Small acts repeated until trust became muscle memory. Years later, Bright Futures became a known name across several hospital networks. The organization supported 2,000 children in its first year, a number the news outlets repeated with admiration, and continued to expand cautiously. By then, the Alburys had become a common example of a partnership that had been tested and reshaped by truth. When asked in interviews about how they managed to keep the marriage and the mission intact, both of them would mention always the same things: honesty, humility, and the willingness to turn fear into action that included rather than excluded the people you love. There were no cinematic endings, no sudden tidy miracles. But there were plenty of small ones. A mother who could pay for medication, a volunteer whose life found meaning in service, a hospital that could call Bright Futures and expect a quick, compassionate response. The work never outgrew the need to be careful with each other. It never required the kind of performance that public life can demand. Instead, it asked for the slow, consistent practice of showing up. On a quiet morning much like the one where the story had begun, sunlight pooling against the window, coffee on the counter, the city muted, David stood at the bedroom window. Jessica moved about the kitchen in the soft choreography of someone who has the whole day mapped in small, loving motions. She paused at the car as she had 6 months earlier, reached to the door with that same habitual grace, and then she turned her head and lifted her face as if to taste the air. The smile touched her mouth first, then the whole of her face, private and radiant. David felt the old sharpness of suspicion start to rise, a ghost muscle memory. But he did not follow it this time. He lifted his cup, let it steam in his hands, and watched her smile, not as a riddle to be solved but as an offering between two people who had learned a costly but generous lesson. She looked up and caught his gaze. The smile held. It did not hide. He stepped out from behind the glass and met her on the front steps without drama. There was nothing to prove now, only a life to continue building. "If you believe in stories like ours," he heard himself say as they walked back inside together, "tell someone today." It was not a line meant for a stage, but a small nudge born of a hope that other frightened people might choose partnership over secrecy. They sat down at the kitchen table and Jessica reached across and took his hand. Her fingers were warm, calloused in a way that told of nights on the ward and days at a desk where budgets were balanced with human faces in mind. He squeezed back, and for the first time since the smile had lodged in him like a stone, the feeling in his chest was not one of guarding, but of sharing. If this story has moved you, hit subscribe and tell us where you're watching from. If it has made you think of someone who might be encouraged, share it. And if you're moved to support similar causes, there are small, practical ways to get involved. Local hospitals and community funds always need steady hands as much as generous hearts.